sucking at something is the first step to being kinda sorta good at something. At least, that's what we're telling ourselves. Welcome to Pixel Latte, a show about the intersection of pop culture and video games. Today, we're talking about how we talk about video games. Simple stuff, right? I'm Lee, and joining me, the vegan heartthrob from America's Heartland, Joe.
Hey, yeah, simple stuff.
So, we know that the video game industry is just gargantuan, right? But I don't want to compare it to films or books like most people do. I feel like that's overdone. I want to compare it to something that I think is more interesting. I have a statistic for you. Are you ready?
Buckled in. Let's go.
Jesus fucking Christ, don't say shit like that on my show. So,
Go.
okay. So according to Pew Research, 31% of Americans say they go to religious service once a week. Now, how many people do you think play video games sometimes or often, according to Pew Research, which I assume is at least once a week? Give me a number.
So like as a percentage of the population, or are we talking just numbers?
Percentage,
so maybe
percentage. No, I want the exact number down to the decimal point.
Okay, so at least 60.23456%.
You know, it's actually a little bit lower than that. It's like 43%, I think, according to Pew Research. But that's, I mean, then you're probably closer to the 60 once you add in the percentage of people who play video games like rarely or sometimes, right? It's a distinction. So I just thought that was kind of like, if you stop back and you think about it, right? Like America is like, it's basically a country founded by a bunch of religious nutjobs. And now there are like, the thing we have in common is
I think this is like really interesting, right? Because you have like culture kind of emerges from what people partake in a sense. Religion had a huge point in the foundation of our country, like you said, and it kind of like so many things that we have now kind of grew out of that. Like the fact that we're like a white Christian country is still very much a thing. And the fact that so many people are going to video games now, like relative to like religion, you would imagine that they're getting a form of culture from that. Though it's entertainment, like that doesn't make a difference. Like you're still experiencing culture through the lens of games.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to get at. You know, like one of the things that's fascinated me as someone that sort of like lived and grew up in like the rural sort of red part of America and then moved to like the urban blue part is sort of like the decline of civic engagement. And so it's hard. I don't want to paint this with too broad a brush, right? Because like I'm doing this on the fly. Like there's the chance I'm excluding something very important. But like as a whole, we used to have a lot more stuff in common. Obviously, if like you were an African American living in the 1940s, you didn't have as much in common with a middle class white suburban family in the 1940s. But there were things that we generally sort of took for granted to have in common, like Life magazine. You had your civic groups like Lions Club, Rotary Club, Kiwanis, Boy Scouts, all that stuff. And what we've seen is sort of like these big, sort of like cultural hubs where people come together and meet and exchange ideas, that has sort of membership or participation that has slowly declined over the past few decades. And so if we don't have that sort of shared language of just being, of what it means to be an American, then what are we left with, right? And the thing that we're left with, to me, is pop culture. And even that's fragmented, right? Like there's so many streaming options.
Yeah, like the way you engage with 100%, the way you engage with your community, if you do at all, is like totally different. And like the way, I don't really notice or see many communities engaging in the same way. But like to bring this back around to video games, like I imagine you're thinking about already, is that like people do connect and engage through video games, right? Like that form of connection to other people, like it's transferred in different ways to the technological medium. And I think video games is one of the most common ways that we connect with others.
Yeah, definitely. And unlike, you know, like say movies or books, I mean, yeah, there's book clubs and yeah, you go see movies together, but video games, just because of at least the way the medium is at today, the way it's progressed, it's a lot more, there's more shared experiences, right? Like if I read, well, if I read, that's funny. If I read Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self, to use a really big brain book because I want to sound impressive, the odds of you and me talking about that are pretty low. Now, if I played Fortnite, the odds of you and me talking about that are pretty high, right? So yeah, that's one of the reasons this fascinates me, is because I feel like video games, they're like a really fertile ground to really sort of discuss what it means to be an American, and that's like such a value loaded phrase, right? But it's just, there's just so much there to unpack, and that's sort of what frustrates me about sort of the, I'm just going to say broadly, the content creation space around video games. So video game reviewers, content creators, what have you, is that it's still very surface level, which I get, right? Because video games, they're entertainment products, right?
Yeah, and entirely. Like, largely, I think people think of them as an entertainment product that they engage with in a certain way. But like, nonetheless, like the American values are imprinted on like a lot of games, right? Like, they're inescapable, and reviews aren't like normally like entering into games that way. They're not trying to look at games that way, like you're saying.
I mean, it really feels like that space just hasn't really evolved, even though games themselves have mechanically evolved, right? So, we have game journalism. We have people that cite sources now, which is great. We weren't doing that consistently as a profession back in the day. And then we have folks like, Jason Schreier, Lee Alexandria, Cecilia D'Astanio, and I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's names, but they're doing like really good investigative, hard-hitting industry exposés. And then you have the sort of video game essay content space, which is, I think, the space that we will eventually occupy. And that's people like, Super Bunny Hop, Jacob Geller, Eurothug, 4000, Noah Caldwell Gervais. And then, there are some outlets like Vice, where they look at video games not as just sort of like a product review, but as a thing that is sort of like culturally significant, right? But that is like, to me, and maybe I'm just not looking hard enough or looking in the right spaces, that seems like it's a very small part of the video game content creation space, right? Does that?
No. Yeah, I think you're totally on point there. I think like a lot of gaming criticism right now, if you go to Reddit, if you go to Twitter, you go to any of these areas that kind of amass like all the gaming discussion, and you just look at it accumulatively, it is the majority is largely not focused on like culture issues, socioeconomic issues. A lot of the way we talk about games isn't trying to view games from that lens. They're mostly technical and mechanical in nature, which all totally do have their merit. And I mean, conversations are inevitably going to intersect with those parts of video games, because you cannot escape the technical or mechanical way that people like engage with them. But yeah, I don't think that most criticism today is really moving in that direction, and that leaves a void for something that is ultimately saying a lot about our like culture, right? Games do say a lot about our culture, regardless on like whether or not you engage with them, particularly in that way.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it seem like we're trying to throw existing content creators under the bus, right, or existing outlets under the bus, like because it makes sense from like a cold hard business perspective, right? Like this is a lot of work. We've spent like months on this episode, and it's probably not going to be that great. Like, it's not going to be groundbreaking. We're not going to be trending on Twitter. But and then apart from that, like when you're just reviewing a video game, just a traditional review where you're focused on the mechanics, does it run? Does it feel nice to play? Does it make me feel like Spider-Man? That's also a lot of work. Like, the time commitment's huge. Like, video games, they're just not as accessible as books or movies. The cost of entry is high. Then once you get the thing, assuming you have a lot of of the existing vocabulary to play the game, right? Like, could you imagine if you had just been dumped into Minecraft and you had never played a video game before? That would be insanely confusing, right? So then you've got to play it for like dozens, if not hundreds of hours. And then you're taking notes the whole time. and then you can start the review process. And oh my god, the video game just came out, and IGN beat us to the scoop, and now we have to get it out as well because they get all the traffic, right? So, like, I'm sympathetic to the cold hard capitalist constraints of video game reviews and video game content creation. But that doesn't.
I mean, it seems. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna finish and say that doesn't mean that, like, just because it's that way doesn't mean it has to be that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't. It doesn't have to be that way, and I feel like there could be more of that type of conversation. It's just it's an inevitability of, you say, like, the market proposition of talking about games right now. It feels like you're kind of streamlined into talking about these aspects that bring people in for the purposes of, like, maintaining kind of like that business, if you're approaching this from a perspective of business. And, like, that's understandable because this takes a lot of time and you might want that sort of revenue from doing this. But it is just kind of a reality of, like, where we're at. And I don't hold any ill will against anyone who's talking about games on a mechanical or technical level. I think they're doing great work and they're pushing the medium forward in their own ways, right? But I think it's important, if we really want the medium to push forward kind of like collectively and like holistically, it's important to, like, approach games from all these different angles.
Right, totally. So this morning I was actually listening to an old interview with Joe Juba of Game Informer about how to write video game reviews. And one of the main takeaways of the interview was you should lead with the most important stuff first. And this was in response to the second paragraph lore dump that most reviewers do. Like at this point, like, there's basically a template on how to review games. Like, this is the latest game from Ubisoft. Lore dump. Mechanics dump. Is this game fun? And then, oh my god, my editor gave me a 1,000-word limit, and I've got 5 words left, and you're
well, it's
done,
like,
right?
there's a lot of competing factors here, right? It's like, why do people even come to reviews? Are people coming to reviews to make a purchasing decision, or is it just to, like, even learn about the game that, like, you're talking about? Because a lot of reviews are written from the perspective of, like, this is what this game even is. Because, like, you know, and if it's not a big ticket game, if it's not a Call of Duty, you may not even know what you're getting into, right?
Right. Yeah. No. Totally. Yeah. And I guess that my takeaway from Joe Juba's thing was what is the most important stuff first? Like, what is the most important thing? You know, I don't know that mechanics or story is always the most important thing.
The way they prioritize and structure and order reviews also has to compete against, like, the fleeting interest of, like, people in this sort of, like, information age or post-information age, where there's just this, like, deluge of, like, flood of information just slapping you every day. Like, you just open your phone and here's 1,000 news articles, here's 500 games that released. Like, the attention span that one can, like, dedicate, you know, to any particular thing, I think that is a competing factor in, like, the size of reviews and the structure of reviews for games and how you can talk about it. Like, there is, like, even dedicated gamers like us don't have the bandwidth to go to every cultural discussion on games and, like, listen to all of them in depth.
Yeah, it almost feels like a Herculean task at this point to sort of talk about video games from, like, a cultural perspective. Right, it's like
there's a lot to lift there, right?
There is, and it's like I'm thinking specifically of Civilization right now, like which on the surface doesn't seem like too problematic of a game series, right? Like it's just a fun 4X strategy game.
Well, it tries to adopt, like, you can play many different civilizations from, like, diverse backgrounds. Like, on the surface, like you said, it would seem that it is offering perhaps even a more positive conversation than, like, most games at the surface level.
Yeah. And but once you start to dive in there, like, it gets kind of weird. It gets kind of icky, right? Like, there's, like, this weird sort of environmental determinism. The bonuses that it gives to civilizations are saying this is what we think the most definitive thing about this culture is, and this culture, like, the thing that's best about them is maybe it's like maybe they don't have culture, maybe they're like a warlike culture, right? And that feels very retrograde. It feels very like a very shallow way of looking at a lot of cultures, especially.
Well, sure, and, like, you can even I love that point, because you can even step it back and say that, like, this isn't, like, this isn't the most definitive things about these cultures. This is what the developers perceive were the important things about these cultures as it relates to mechanical benefits in the game. But that's still a culture call. Like, you're still having to think about them culturally. Like, there is still that conversation being conveyed there.
Yeah, totally. And I you know, I think those things should be. This is the thing that I struggle with. Is like, do those things, should they be called out? Should they be mentioned at all? Does it affect my enjoyment of civilization to know that they kind of have a racist take on India? Like, if I'm being honest with myself, it doesn't really infect my enjoyment of it. But maybe if someone talked more critically about it, maybe it would. Like, this is something that's like you think about a game series like Call of Duty, right? It's a game series that's like incredibly problematic, just like literally whitewashing war crimes in the single player mode, right?
You can't walk 5 steps in that game without walking into some cultural conundrum.
Yeah, it's almost like the series is like the epitome of like everything that's wrong with gaming culture. Like, I don't maybe wrong's too harsh, but it's like it's almost like gaming culture distilled into like one game series, which is like very chest beating masculinity, sort of like an adolescent appreciation of guns and muscles and explosions. Like, it's not trying to say anything deep, and by doing that, it ends up being kind of a searing indictment of itself and the people that enjoy it.
Oh, totally. Yeah. What makes the Call of Duty franchise like epitomize this, like, and be really a reflection of this issue is that like Activision and certain people in there have been like insistent that they try to make like apolitical games like at points, and it's like you cannot turn these inherently like political conflicts into apolitical things, and when you do, you misstep and you make massive freaking mistakes. And like, I think that's like that with the release of Cold War right now, like we're already seeing that, and there's already a lot of criticism about like the way that Cold War is the new Cold War Call of Duty game is approaching the Cold War itself.
Yeah, totally. So I guess the point that I'm trying to like circle back to, or that I'm trying to make, is that, you know, video game criticism, it doesn't have to be like this like nuanced dissection of what it means when you get like when you can have bigger cities as India and it affects like your happiness score. Like, I can't remember the exact whatever. At the same time, like, we shouldn't wait for like big controversies like Call of Duty, Cold War. There's got to be a happy balance between those two, right? Because like, I mean, if we just think about the way we talk about video games, they're very hype driven, right? It's like, check out this new game. You know, you've got to play this new game. Look at how much fun everybody is having playing this new game. And it's like, we just get wrapped up in this like this hype, this adulation. Sarah Kent in The Guardian had a great article a few years ago, and I just want to read a quick segment from it. She writes, adulation is as poisonous as neglect. The arts thrive in a climate of lively and informed debate. Emerging artists need the endorsement of an intelligent response, and successful artists, under pressure to churn out more of the same, need encouragement to risk failure by trying something new. So to bring this back to Civilization from like 5 minutes ago, or however many minutes ago it'll be when I edit this down to something coherent, like, we always just sort of like take barbarians in Civilization to just be bad, right? And like, they're bad because they stand in opposition to these very static points of culture. And like, it doesn't seem too bad, because like, you know, if you take like, I'm going to use air quotes that no one can see, but if you take like the quote unquote barbarian cultures that we typically associate with quote unquote barbarians, like the Mongols, they're in the game as civilizations. But it's like, it still feels kind of like, that's not quite how civilization works, right? Like, there are people that exist on the outskirts of static cities, right? That have their own vibrant form of civilization. And it seems kind of fucked up that we're just sort of like, the only logical endpoint for barbarians in civilization is to be eradicated from the entire face of the earth because they're incompatible with civilization. Like if you say that, if you think about it, that sounds kind of icky. So like,
That does sound pretty icky. And like, I think this is maybe a good point to like also emphasize that I think these like destructive conversations where you're breaking down the cultural conflicts within games and how they may not match up with how we reason about the world or the world ought to be working today. I think those are important conversations, but it's also really important to note that video games can be like these cultural conversations around games, these socio-political conversations can also be constructive. Like they can help you make more interesting games, kind of like what you were hitting on.
Yeah, and that's what I want. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say was that how Civilization could be potentially more interesting if a game reviewer was like, hey, you know what, this isn't quite cool, this isn't quite how civilizations worked. Wouldn't it be cool if civilizations weren't forced to be static cities? You know, like if you think about just nomadic civilizations, it's kind of weird that they're forced to not be nomadic. Right.
And there's like a lot of nomadic populations today that do not necessarily like align with a particular city or even like geographic region. Like this is a huge thing. And like cities themselves like move, they crumble, they grow, they shrink. They're not like static entities over time. And so imagine like adding that as another mechanical layer to the game. Also like making the conflicts more diverse in like games. Like in real life, like you said, I seriously doubt barbarians were like a critical threat to like all civilizations trying to be formed. And if you like felt that out and make that a little more dynamic and not so focused on just like the barbarian aspect, like it would make for such a more interesting game and also remove that problematic bit. I think it's because the conversations themselves are like in a stasis, right? Like in minute mechanical ways, these games have evolved. And like you'll see people out there like diehards like Civ 4 is like the best civilization, or like Civ 6 is like disappointing for this reason, like mechanical reason X. Like there are mechanical minute details that have changed over time. Like the minutia has changed, but largely these franchises have in a sense remained the same because they're engaging in like a lot of the same conversations, right?
Yeah,
they're
totally.
Not like, yeah, they're not critically engaging themselves.
Yeah, and well, it's like a question of language, right? So I'm gonna like sound really super pretentious for a second. Okay, so bear with me.
And you haven't this whole time?
I know. I set that up and you knocked them down. So when you go back and you read like philosophers like say Descartes, right? And they're dealing with like this new concept. The way they talk about it is very clunky because they don't have the language for this new concept later. And then if you fast forward like 100 years, like the conversation about that particular concept is theoretically, depending on whatever thinking you're reading, is much easier to understand because that concept has sort of like been internalized and talked about. And so I guess that's what makes this conversation so tricky, is because we don't have the language for this conversation yet, but also B, like game developers, they're dealing with this like very like they have their own language, right? And because no one's ever challenged them on that language, or because they haven't thought critically about that challenge, they're just going to keep like retreading the same ground, right?
And it's
like,
not to say that like challenging them in the sense of like, oh, dear developers, how could you portray barbarians in this way? How dare you do this particular thing? It's not to brandish them, but it's to throw out there that like, hey, maybe these things, like let's talk together. Let's start a conversation on how we can do these things better, because we all have our preconceived biases, notions, and like our products of the environments that we like socially experience and grow up in, right? Like none of this is to like smack anyone and say like you're doing it wrong, but just how can we start a conversation?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think everyone wants games to move forward creatively, like evolve. We want our Call of Duties, but we also want whatever the next PUBG is. And we're not going to have that unless we start thinking about the way we talk about games differently. And then just kind of like a little segue, a little off topic. Like, I think sort of like talking about video games from like a cultural perspective can like make our enjoyment of video games a lot more interesting, a lot more robust. And I don't know that that's necessarily I like Easy Allies. I like Game Informer Show. I like MinMax. I like what's another one? Kind of Funny Games. Like those are all great shows. And like yeah, there's some like differences between them, but at the end of the day, they're gonna have relatively the same sort of takes on video games. And like basically the justification for me watching Easy Allies over the MinMax show really comes down to how I kind of feel in that moment, right? Like there's nothing really like oh, I've got to watch MinMax show because they're like substantively different than Easy Allies. Like it's like they're still talking about game mechanics, right?
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
that's good
like,
and fine. But
yeah.
like if we could talk about the other stuff that informs video games, I think that would be that's really fertile ground that no one's treading.
Yeah, totally. And to make this a little more concrete, and I think we've tried to like exhibit this with various examples, civilization and so on, but like the background, the culture of a person, like it does influence the mechanics that emerge and like in games themselves. Like games exist in an environment, like in a cultural environment, and the mechanics in the game themselves, like they exist there for a reason. Like in the United States, it's no surprise, like in our hyper-capitalist society, that like so many games are based on like competition and particularly accretion and competition when it leads to accretion of rewards, right? Like to the extent that like it's a common system to have in games now, like regardless of whatever you're playing, that has some progression system based on accreting more and more things. And like while some people might suggest that this is like a natural part of like the human psyche, it's also, you can't escape the fact that like it emerged, like these mechanics fundamentally emerged from like capitalist societies and notions of what we consider enjoyable and not, and like other societies have different ideas for what is enjoyable or not, and you can see that in the games that come out of them.
Totally. And but I don't even think you have to go like that abstract, because like then you like it gets difficult because like I want people to be like more be more upfront about like the political implications of video games. At the same time, I realize that like people have a business to run, and you know, if your show is like staunchly conservative or staunchly liberal, like you're gonna drive people off, right? So there are like some practical concerns for not doing that, and I don't think that's right, but I'm sympathetic to that view and I get it. But at the same time, I still think there's takeaways that for making conversations about video games more interesting. So, like a good example, like a really easy to wrap your head around example is Missile Command. So this is an arcade game that was released by Atari in the 1980s. And it is a game that was very much influenced by the Cold War, which is like no surprise because it was made during the Cold War. It's also a very simple game, which is why I'm using it as an example. So you had to protect 6 cities from being destroyed by a never-ending barrage of missiles. So for the game's designer, like this thought of nuclear annihilation, like it gave him nightmares. It's obviously like very much had an influence on the game. And you can, if you think about it critically for just a few minutes and think about the context in which it was made, you can see sort of like his thoughts reflected in the game, his worldview reflected in the game. So like instead of using a traditional game over screen, he opted for something different, which is just like the end, which is like a very stark message to put at the end of a video game, right? And then like your ammunition is limited. You can't attack whoever's launching missiles at you. Like, you're going to lose cities. Like that's just, you're going to lose the game. And the message of that game is very simple. Like in nuclear war, there are no winners. Like everyone loses.
Yeah, and
right?
It feels like a game that captures the culture of like the Cold War era and like the certain defeatism that was like pressing down on like so many people in that time. Like the game is as classic as that game is, it is a direct reflection of the world and the culture in which the developer existed in. And and I think it was intentional on his part, but like there are certain amounts of that which just bleed into the products that you make. Like you can't escape them.
Yeah, I mean, even if we talk about it often. Like, even though Activision it says we don't make political games, and Ubisoft does that to an extent, like you're still saying something about the world, and so I think that's why these conversations are important. Not just from like a making shows more interesting, but just to know more about ourselves, right? Because it feels like,
Well, and like when you in the problem, it's like in its own sense, like trying to make like an apolitical entity or something that doesn't like directly engage with the culture, you're going to end up engaging inevitably with culture, because like the topic of, for example, Call of Duty, and I don't mean to keep throwing stuff at Call of Duty. I think it's like a fine franchise. It has a lot of conversations that I think it could start having, but like by not having these conversations on culture in Call of Duty, like it runs into problems because you're talking about war, which is fundamentally a cultural phenomenon, right? Like of conflict. And so it's like it's kind of like foolish to even try to have like to try and approach that topic without engaging in these sorts of conversations, and you end up making and running into mistakes.
oh yeah, totally. I mean, and I guess that's the other component of this conversation is that like those mistakes shouldn't like those mistakes, like these sort of like cultural flashpoints that we find ourselves at, like these what feels like it feels pointless, but it's actually not pointless, like these pointless culture war arguments we get in all the time. Like they shouldn't come as a surprise to us, right? And when someone like when anyone says like, oh, I wish video games like they wouldn't be so political, I'm like, they've always been political, you've just never noticed because they've always ascribed to your dominant political view. Video games tell us just like a lot about ourselves. What does it tell us that like the most popular video game franchise, like I want to say maybe not quite of all time because Mario might be beating it out, is Call of Duty? Like, what does that say about us, right? What does it say that we are so sort of like resistant to these conversations as a community? What does it say that we as content creators sort of like just skip over these conversations? Like, that's what interests me the most about this project, right?
Yeah, and it's just like it's such fertile ground for what those can tell you about. Like Call of Duty is an aggressive, fast-paced game where you kill thousands of people per second and you rampage through.
You kill thousands of people per second in Call of Duty. How come we're not winning more games? Like, we got crushed in Nuketown. What are you doing?
I guess you just didn't nuke that town hard enough. I don't know. It's like such a pro-military game, and like what does that say about America, the country from which that like franchise emerges? Like what does that say about us? What does it say that so many games of ours are competitive or based on like accretion of resources? Like what does it say that like it's hard for us, for example, to like put female leads in a game, and then like once you do put a female lead in the game, you get into a situation like with Horizon where like that game came out, right? And then, or on its release cycle, like when they were hyping it up, when they were doing the E3 and everything, like they had to start so many conversations talking about like, oh, this is why we chose Aloy. Like it had to be a part of every conversation they had about that game, any like significant one where they justified the fact that they had a female lead in the game. Like, what does it say that like a developer has to go and justify the fact that they have a female lead in their game?
This stuff matters, right? Like it shapes our worldview. It informs how we sort of like talk about ourselves and the world around us. And the stuff like Call of Duty whitewashing war crimes, that stuff's like really, really easy to notice. But the fact that Call of Duty is so popular is a lot harder to notice. So as Elizabeth Mendez-Berry notes in Hyperallergenic, the tiki torches are easy to spot, but more subtle and seductive forms of supremacy, embedded in the pop many Americans consume without question, must be dissected by people fluent in the aesthetics of manipulation. When you boil it down, supremacy is stupefying. Always the same hero, same villain. Culture at its best is the opposite, invigorating, unwielding, haunting, true. Critics can challenge us to become active audiences instead of passive observers. And at their best, critics of color reveal layers that would be invisible without their eyes. So I guess the central thrust of this project in this video is that I want critics to take a more active role in sort of like challenging what is the accepted norm. But I also want those of us who are willing and able to not just accept video games as they are at face value. And by that I don't mean like, don't get upset that like a company does something like super shady like monetization. Like yeah, we should make a fuss about that. But like also we should make a fuss about like these icky cultural elements, because that matters just as much as whether or not, Activision is fleecing the shit out of us,
Yeah, like what I would love out of this is that like if a dozen people watch this, if like a handful of people watch this and they decided that like it would be a great idea to like engage with games culturally just like some of the time, it's not like you and I are sitting down and every second we're thinking about like the cultural messaging of this game and like what it's trying to convey to us. But like if you can at least think about it some of the time while you're playing like the next Call of Duty, the next Battlefield, the next Fortnite expansion, whatever it may be, like if you can think about the culture of like what you're engaging with just like some of the time, that'll be an important part of like evolving this conversation and helping move the medium forward in ways like we should be outraged. I mean, like the gaming community is always outraged. Like when is the gaming community not outraged, right? But I think like we should be outraged when games are nickel and diming us, when like games are like, I don't know, technically marring the experience, or when they're like doing something that they're traditionally held accountable for. Like I feel like these things are valuable, but just like you said, it's as important that we look at the culture of these games and take a lens at that angle, because whether we like it or not, whether we want it to or not, it happens. Like these games convey culture, and like how many people's understandings of culture in reality are even like somewhat like adjusted because of like what they've experienced in games. Like we're holding all these criticisms about like the Cold War as contrasted with how like maybe Call of Duty represents it, but how many people who are maybe not as up to date as us, and I mean we're not experts on the Cold War by any means, but we're up to date enough to say that like this is deeply troubling how like this game is representing the Cold War. How many people aren't at that level, and how many people's thinking or whatever is being like adapted, or like how much of it's being impacted by like what they're experiencing in this game, especially like people like younger people. Like we need to start engaging with these games, and it's not like I'm not saying like the civilization's going to go down in a drain if we don't, but if we don't, like it helps perpetuate a lot of the myths in modern society that aren't true and end up holding us back. It plays a negative role.
Yeah, so like this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, is that, sort of like after the election of Donald Trump, there were a lot of people that were just like, what the hell? This is like, when did this happen? Has America always been like this? And then, we just had another election and people were like, holy shit, this election was like it was a blowout, but it wasn't a blowout enough, right? Like Biden's only had like 6 million, 8 million popular count, like votes right now. And I think if you had sort of just stepped back from, what is it called, the Beltway or whatever, like if you stepped outside of Washington and you talk to sort of like any POC living in America, they would say, no, yeah, it's always been like this, dude. Like this should not come as a surprise to you, right? Like we saw, right after Obama was elected, there was this huge spike in like sort of anti-immigration rhetoric and far-right militias, and I don't want to.
And it's like that reluctance that you're hitting on, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but like that reluctance that you're hitting on, that reluctance to engage in those like tough conversations, to really think about like these kind of like perpetuated like norms that like have been developing and evolving over time. I think like the reluctance to get involved with those things hid the issues, hid the problems, and then it just comes up like when it's the most scary, when it's the most terrifying, because no one bothered to like And it's not that no one did. Like there are many people out there that like after the election like were on point the whole time coming up to this, but like they just weren't in the same conversation as like all the other things, right? And that's the risk you run. Like when you don't engage with these conversations in gaming is that like you have all these problematic aspects in gaming or ways that gamings could be better, and like but especially the problematic part, if you don't engage with them, then like don't be surprised when like the significant issues come out of them and like giant negative movements within gaming sort of form.
Yeah, and I guess I kind of want to end it on a hopeful note, which is to say, like, you know, I think it's safe to say that all of us have someone that voted for Trump in our family, or if you are somehow you've made it this far and you're not angrily typing on your keyboard and you have someone that voted for Biden in your family. I think we can all say at the end of the day that even though stuff about the other side troubles us, I still care deeply and believe in the fundamental goodness of other human beings. Like, not necessarily like grifters who are in this just to get rich, right? And are perpetuating these narratives that just prey on people's base instincts and worst fears, and fears that I think a lot of people are justified in having.
But people do these things not because they think they're bad. Like, no one goes out there and votes with like the malicious intent. Like, I want to make things worse, let's vote bad. Like, Trump voters, Biden voters, any voter, like you're voting because you believe more often than not. Like, I don't want to overgeneralize, but just, yeah, overgeneralizing. People vote because they're voting for good. Like, you want the good thing.
Right. And if we could have conversations, like critical conversations about our cultural diets, right? Like our Call of Duties, I think we would be in a much better place. Like, going back to the earlier statistic, like, we just don't go to religious services anymore as a country. We don't, like, if you join Rotary Club, like I did temporarily, it's all old people. It's usually all old white men, you know? Like, I'm sure the same is true for Kiwanis. I'm sure the same is true for Lions, which I'm just remembering is the club that I actually joined. I didn't actually join Rotary Club. So, like, there's still hope, I guess. Like, it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. Like, the country doesn't have to become further divided. And I'm not so naive to think that, like, if we just talk about video games more critically, that's going to magically solve everything. But this is, like, one area in our space that we can sort of, like, enact change. And it's, yeah, I don't know. It's a template for success at a broader level, you know?
Yeah, and, like, and try to end this on a more positive note myself, because I know I've been very gloomy the whole time, but like, what's the advice that you often hear in relationships, be it romantic or otherwise, for like getting along with the other person? It's to respect and to communicate. And I feel like if we communicate, then we can like work our way up from there.
Yeah, totally. All right, well, that's our show. We'll have another episode for you in 8 months. See you later.
Or less. See ya.